The clipboard hit my lap before the epidural had even worn off. My father was already lifting Wyatt's bassinet toward the door. Brenda pressed a pen into my hand, her fingers cold as the metal bed rail. "You have 2 babies," my father said, flat as a grocery list. "Your sister has none. Sign the transfer or we take him right now." I didn't scream, I didn't cry. My thumb found the red button built into the bedside console and pressed down. The alarm started somewhere down the hall before it reached my room, a low electronic pulse that made Brenda's hand freeze on the pen. I kept my voice level. I kept my face still. Stillness was the only thing I had left that they couldn't take from me. My father and Brenda thought they were taking advantage of a mother whose husband was 3,000 miles away on an offshore rig, too far to stop them. They had no idea that 4 days from now, an attempted abduction and guardianship fraud report would be sitting on a district attorney's desk, and that Brenda's trust fund would be frozen down to the last dollar. 3 years earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. David and I lived in a rented 3-bedroom outside Katy, the kind of subdivision with a community pool nobody used past July and an HOA newsletter nobody read. He worked offshore, 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, coming home smelling like salt and diesel and falling asleep on the couch before dinner was even plated. I taught 4th grade at the elementary school 2 exits down 99. We ate at the same HEB every Sunday. We were not rich. We were fine. My father was not fine with fine. Richard had a house in River Oaks with a wine cellar he'd built himself and a Tesla he barely drove because he preferred the Land Cruiser for practical reasons he never explained. Brenda ran a boutique off Post Oak that sold $300 candles nobody was allowed to light. Every visit to their house came with an inventory of what David, and I didn't have, the granite, the second fridge in the garage, the gate code that changed every few months without anyone telling us until we were standing outside it in the rain. My half-sister Maya lived 2 streets over from them, in a house Richard had put the down payment on. She and her husband had been trying for a baby for 6 years, 3 rounds of IVF. 2 losses I only heard about secondhand, from Brenda, delivered like weather reports, flat, factual, over before I could say anything that mattered. I never once heard Maya say she resented me. She didn't have to. It was in the way she stopped coming to Thanksgiving the year I got pregnant with the twins, and the way Brenda started calling twice a day to ask how far along I was, like she was tracking something instead of someone. 2 years into our marriage, Richard offered to co-sign a mortgage so David and I could finally buy instead of rent. He handed us the paperwork himself, smiling the whole time. Buried on page 4 was a clause giving him final approval on any future refinance, any addition, any sale. David caught it before I did. We turned him down and stayed in the rental. Richard didn't speak to us for 3 months. He didn't need to say why. The silence was the message. When I finally told them I was pregnant with twins, Brenda hugged me a beat too long and asked, quiet enough that David didn't hear, whether we'd thought it through financially. Maya didn't say anything at all. She just picked at the label on her water bottle until it came off in one long strip and never looked up. 2 months before my due date, David's company extended his rig assignment. A routine 4-week rotation turned into 8 when a hurricane spun up off the Yucatan and shut down half the shipping lanes in the Gulf. His calls got shorter. Then they got rarer. The last text I got from him for 11 days said only storms bad, sat phone down, love you both, because we already knew it was twins. I didn't tell him how big I'd gotten or how the doctor had started using words like monitoring and just to be safe. I didn't want him carrying that 3,000 miles from anywhere he could do something about it. At 34 weeks, I woke up at 4 a.m. to a pain that didn't feel like the practice contractions the books talked about. It came in a straight line, low and hard, and didn't let go for almost a minute. I counted the next one on the microwave clock, 6 minutes apart. I called my father first. It made sense at the time. He lived 20 minutes away, and David was unreachable, and some old habit in me still believed that in an actual emergency, blood would show up. Dad, it's early. I think I'm in labor. Can you drive me to Methodist? There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard him exhale, the particular sound he made when he was inconvenienced rather than concerned. "Clara, I've got the Anderson deposition at 8. Just call an Uber." He hung up before I could answer. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone still warm against my ear, staring at a dark screen, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. I didn't call him back. I didn't call Brenda. I called 911. The dispatcher kept me talking while the contractions stacked closer together, 5 minutes, then 4. I packed my hospital bag one-handed between them. The going-home outfit still folded in their tags, the phone charger, David's flannel shirt that still smelled like him even after 3 washes. I left a voicemail on his satellite line that I didn't know if he'd get before Thursday. The paramedics found me sitting on the porch steps in the dark, my bag beside me, because I couldn't make myself wait inside alone. One of them, a woman about my age with a ponytail pulled through the back of her cap, crouched down and asked who was coming to meet me at the hospital. "Nobody yet," I told her. It came out steadier than I expected. She didn't say anything else about it. She just helped me up, and the gurney legs folded under me with a sound like a stapler, and the ambulance doors swung shut on the porch light still burning behind me, on the house going dark and small the way things do through the little back windows. My phone sat in the bag at my feet the whole ride, screen black, no missed calls. Not from my father, not yet from David. By the time I was wheeled into a delivery room at Methodist, my father already knew. A nurse must have called him back when I listed him as next of kin on intake, some formality nobody explained to me until later. He didn't call me, he called Brenda. I found out afterward, in pieces, what happened during the 6 hours I was in labor without a single person who loved me in the building. Brenda had been the one to say it out loud first, according to what came out later in the police report. Twins, 2 grandchildren born in one afternoon to a daughter who already had a husband, a house, a life Richard considered beneath what he'd raised her for. And 2 doors down, in a house he'd paid the down payment on, a daughter who'd spent 6 years and 3 rounds of IVF trying to get one. Richard didn't see 2 newborns. He saw an imbalance he had the power to correct. He had a lawyer on retainer for the boutique's leases, not a family law attorney, just someone who owed him a favor and didn't ask enough questions. Somewhere in the 2 hours before he and Brenda walked into my recovery room, a document got put together that was built to look, at a glance, indistinguishable from the stack of discharge and consent forms every new mother signs half-conscious. Brenda's plan was simple. Exhausted, medicated, alone, I wouldn't read it. I'd just sign where the tabs told me to. Maya wasn't in the room when they decided it. I want to be fair about that, because everything after made it easy to lump the 3 of them together, and it wasn't quite that simple. But she also didn't call to warn me. She let it happen at a distance, the same way she'd let 6 years of silence happen at a distance, and there's a kind of complicity in that too. I came out of surgery a little after 2 in the afternoon. The twins were already out, Wyatt first, then Emmy, 90 seconds apart, both of them small and furious and perfect, both of them breathing on their own, which the doctor told David later was more than they'd hoped for at 34 weeks. I remember surfacing in pieces, the fluorescent light overhead, a nurse's voice somewhere to my left, running through numbers I couldn't follow yet, the particular heaviness in my arms that comes from magnesium and blood loss and a body that has just done something enormous. And then my father, standing at the foot of the bed in a suit he hadn't bothered to change out of, and Brenda beside him with a clipboard already in her hands. "There's some paperwork," Brenda said, and her voice was doing the thing it always did when she wanted something bright, brisk, already assuming I'd agree. "Standard stuff. Discharge and guardianship contingency in case anything happens with David stuck out there. We just need your signature." I was still finding the edges of the room. I remember thinking, distantly, that it was strange for them to be handling my discharge paperwork at all. I remember my hand moving toward the pen because some deep, exhausted part of me had spent 30 years learning to do what my father asked without making him repeat himself. That's when Richard crossed to the bassinet by the window and lifted it. "You have 2 babies," he said, and his voice had no more warmth in it than if he'd been reading off a shipping manifest. "Your sister has none. Sign the transfer or we take him right now." The room came into focus all at once, the way cold water does. My thumb was already on the button. I don't remember deciding to press it. My hand had made the decision somewhere underneath conscious thought, the same place that had called 911 instead of waiting on a ride that wasn't coming. The alarm outside the room built fast, a rising two-tone pulse followed by fast, flat-soled footsteps in the hallway. Richard didn't move the bassinet any further. He stood there holding it, my newborn son 18 inches from his chest, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him have to decide something in real time instead of already knowing the answer. Brenda's hand was still on the clipboard. "Clara, don't be dramatic, it's just." 2 nurses came through the door first, then hospital security a half step behind, a broad man in a navy polo with a radio already up at his shoulder. His eyes went straight to the bassinet in my father's hands, then to me. "Ma'am, what's happening in here?" I kept my voice level, not loud, not shaking. I'd spent 30 years learning how to sound calm around my father, and it turned out that skill had a use I'd never imagined. "That man is my father. He's trying to take my son out of this room without my authorization. That woman put a document in front of me and told me it was standard discharge paperwork. It isn't." Richard set the bassinet down. Slowly, like it had been his idea all along, like he was simply repositioning it for the nurse's convenience. "This is a family matter," he said. "There's no need for." "Sir, step away from the bassinet." The security guard's voice didn't rise, but it left no room in it either. A second nurse moved past Brenda and lifted the clipboard out of her hands without asking, scanning the top page, her face going still in a way that told me everything I needed to know about what was on it. "This isn't a hospital discharge form," she said quietly, to the guard, not to Brenda. The room had gone very cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Brenda's brisk, bright voice had disappeared entirely. She stood with her empty hands at her sides like she didn't know what to do with them anymore. Richard's jaw was set, and I recognized the look, the one he wore in the seconds after a deal went sideways, recalculating, looking for the angle that still worked in his favor. There wasn't one, not this time. A second security officer arrived with a wheeled bassinet of his own, and with a nurse's nod, moved Wyatt out of my father's reach and across the room to where Emmy already lay under the warmer, both of them now on the far side of me, out of anyone's hands but the staff's. I watched my father's arms go empty, and something in my chest finally loosened, just slightly, for the first time since I'd woken up. "I want you to call the police," I told the security guard. My voice still hadn't risen. "I want to file a report, both of them." Brenda made a small sound, somewhere between a laugh and a gasp, like she still expected this to resolve itself the way every family conflict of my whole life had resolved itself, with me apologizing for the inconvenience of my own feelings. Richard just looked at me, and for one long second, I watched him understand that this daughter was not going to fold. "Clara," he said low, almost gentle, the voice he used when he wanted something and thought softness might still work. "You're overreacting. We were trying to help Maya. You have too. She has none. Family helps family." "Family doesn't forge documents on a woman 4 hours out of surgery," I said. "Get out of my room." The nurse with the clipboard was already on the phone, reading something off the top page to whoever was on the other end, her voice low and clipped. Somewhere down the hall, I heard the elevator chime, and beneath it, fainter, the first crackle of a police radio. 2 officers arrived within 12 minutes, which the nurse later told me was fast for a weekday afternoon, faster. I understood without her saying so, because the words infant and unauthorized removal moved things along a hospital's priority list quickly. I gave my statement from the bed, with Emmy asleep against my chest and Wyatt in the warmer beside me, because the nurses had decided, without needing to be asked twice, that my babies weren't leaving my sight again that day. I told the officers about the phone call that morning, just call an Uber, and the ambulance ride alone, and the clipboard, and the exact words my father had used at the foot of the bed. I kept my voice steady through all of it. Somewhere in the retelling, steady stopped being a performance and started being simply true. The younger officer photographed the document page by page before bagging it as evidence. The older one, a woman with silver at her temples and the unhurried patience of someone who had done this exact walkthrough more times than she could count, sat with Richard and Brenda in the family consultation room down the hall. I didn't see what happened in there. I only saw the aftermath. My father walked out first, his tie loosened, his face arranged into the particular stillness he wore when he'd run out of leverage. Brenda came out a step behind him, and for the first time in 11 years of knowing her, she wasn't performing anything at all. She just looked tired and small and caught. They were both read their rights in the hallway outside my room. I heard it through the half-open door, attempted removal of a minor without custodial authorization, and forgery of a legal document filed as a felony given the circumstances. Neither of them looked back toward my room as they were walked to the elevator. I don't know if that was shame or simply Richard recalculating his next move all the way to the parking garage. David landed at Hobby 31 hours later, having gotten a company boat off the rig the moment the storm cleared enough to fly a helicopter out to it, then a red-eye connection he didn't remember booking. He came straight from the airport in the same clothes he'd been wearing on the rig, still smelling faintly of diesel, and he didn't say anything when he walked into the room. He just crossed to the bassinets first, one hand on each of them, like he needed to confirm with his own hands what I'd already told him twice on the phone. Then he came to me, and I felt something in my chest that had been rigid for 2 days finally come apart. "I should never have let you call him that morning," he said into my hair, which wasn't fair to either of us. He'd been on a rig with no signal, and neither of us had known what my father would do with an opening like that. But I understood what he meant. He meant I should have been the one you could call. We hired a family law attorney named Priya Shah the next week, on the recommendation of the hospital's own patient advocate, who'd clearly seen enough of these cases to have a list ready. Priya's first move wasn't the criminal case. The DA's office already had that moving on its own, methodically. The way these things do once a document examiner confirms a signature was never actually mine. Her first move was asking a question nobody in my family had ever encouraged me to ask. "Do you know how your stepmother's boutique is funded?" I didn't, not really. I'd always assumed Brenda's store ran on Richard's money the way everything in that house ran on Richard's money, an allowance dressed up as independence. It turned out to be more complicated and far more useful to me than that. 11 years earlier, when Richard married Brenda, he'd folded a chunk of the family estate into something called the Whitmore Family Revocable Trust, a vehicle set up on paper to eventually pass wealth down to his children and grandchildren, skip some estate tax along the way, keep the lawyers happy. Brenda's boutique lease, her inventory lines of credit, even the SUV she drove, all of it ran through disbursements from that trust, quarterly, automatic, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. What Richard had never planned for was that a revocable trust, by its nature, needed a trustee with actual authority once the grantor's own conduct came into question. And when the original paperwork had been drawn up back when I was 24, newly married, still the daughter he considered his most stable investment, he'd named me primary successor trustee. A formality at the time. A line item nobody expected to matter, tucked into a binder I'd signed without reading closely, the way you sign things for people you still trust. Priya found it in an afternoon. "He gave you the keys to the car," she said, "and never thought you'd learn to drive." I didn't do anything with it right away. Some old habit in me still wanted to be sure, wanted 3 separate lawyers to confirm what one already had. But 4 days after the hospital, 4 days, almost to the hour, the DA's office formally filed charges against Richard and Brenda, attempted unauthorized removal of a minor, and second-degree forgery of a legal instrument. That same afternoon, on Priya's advice and with my signature as trustee, I froze every disbursement out of the Whitmore Trust pending a full accounting. Brenda's boutique missed its next inventory payment 9 days later. I didn't watch it happen. I heard about it the way I'd once heard about Maya's second miscarriage, second-hand, flat, a fact reported rather than felt. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a door finally closing on a room I'd spent my whole life standing just outside of, waiting to be let in. The court granted a temporary restraining order within the week, then a permanent one a month later, once the criminal case had built enough of a record to make the judge's decision easy. Richard and Brenda are barred from contact with me, with David, and with the twins, no calls, no visits, no gifts left on a porch, nothing. Richard took a plea on a reduced charge rather than risk trial. Brenda's case is still moving through the system as I write this. The boutique closed for good in March. Maya reached out once, a single text in April, 3 lines long. She said she hadn't known what they were planning that day and that she was sorry. I believe the first part. I'm less sure about the second, and I haven't answered yet. Some doors you leave ajar, others you're allowed to just let close. We brought the twins home on a Tuesday in early spring, 6 weeks after the hospital, once both of them had cleared the weight the doctors wanted before they'd sign off. David drove 5 miles under the limit the entire way, both hands on the wheel like the car itself might understand the stakes. I sat in the back between 2 car seats, one hand resting on each small chest, feeling them breathe. The house looked exactly like it had the morning I left it in an ambulance, the porch light still on a timer, the same crack in the driveway we kept meaning to patch. But it felt different walking back into it with both of them in my arms instead of alone in my body. David had painted the nursery while I was still in the hospital. A soft sage green he picked because I'd once mentioned liking it in passing, months earlier, and somehow he'd remembered. We changed our numbers, not out of fear, out of finality. Richard's plea deal keeps him 3 years from any unsupervised contact with a minor, us included, and the restraining order makes the rest of it a formality neither of us needed reminding of. Brenda's trial date keeps getting pushed. I don't check the docket anymore. Some part of me used to think I'd feel a sense of closure watching it play out. Instead, I feel something quieter, just the absence of a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd mistaken it for my own shape. Maya's text still sits unanswered on my phone. I think about it sometimes, usually late at night with one of the twins asleep on my chest and the house gone still around us. I don't know yet if there's a version of that relationship worth rebuilding, or if some family ties are only ever meant to hold as much weight as they were built for, and no more. I'm not in a hurry to decide. What I know for certain is this. Wyatt has David's stubborn chin and my temper, and Emmy already refuses to be put down before she's finished looking at whatever's caught her attention. They are loud and healthy and entirely, fiercely ours, no clipboards, no conditions, no family meetings where someone decides what we owe each other. Would you have pressed charges against your own parents after what they tried to do in that hospital room? Let us know in the comments below. If stories like this one are your kind of thing, don't forget to subscribe. This is Casterly Payback, and I'll see you in the next one, and I am waiting for your comment.